Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Soccer Queens podcast, where we discuss everything female athlete performance training. I can't wait for this conversation today. I have been following this guest for a while on Twitter. It seems I've been meeting everyone on Twitter here, and I was drawn to Brendan because of his work with performance and rehab and just that blend of both. But I also really loved his track and his speed development content. And I personally have gotten a lot from following track people. Brendan, Tony Holler, I guess Mike Whiteman might be honorary track at this point. But yeah, Brendan, your work has been just so impactful for me, and I'm really glad to have you on. So thanks for being here.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
So, for people who don't know who you are, why don't you just give a background of your coaching and what you're up to today?
Yeah. So I started as a sprinter at the University of Iowa and kind of worked my way up through the ranks to eventually become an All American. And when I got into physical therapy school, I started my performance training business, mostly using track principles to train speed and performance. And over the last several years, I've started to kind of deviate away from a strictly track centric program. And now I'm kind of diving into the conditioning aspects, the agility, change of direction, and just like general body awareness. And I think that physical therapy school kind of opened up my eyes to some of the biomechanics and some of the things that happen upstream and downstream in the movement chain. And so currently I'm working with a lot of lacrosse, field hockey, football, soccer, and baseball athletes. I'm probably missing some other ones in there. And I also do some remote coaching, but the majority of my coaching is here in the St. Louis area, focusing on athletes from age 11 all the way up to, I think my oldest athlete right now is like 30. So everybody needs it, from novices to masters. And so I just try to kind of guide them with those principles every step of the way.
I love it. And I love that you work with such a nice variety of age, males, females, and sports as well. And I know before we hopped on this conversation and we exchanged messages, we are going to keep this pretty soccer focused, but I would say a lot of this would apply to field hockey, lacrosse for that speed development. So let's just dive into that. What are some of your best tips to develop speed in season and off season?
So in season and off season, I have a very large focus on movement economy. So what I notice are a lot of novice athletes have pretty poor biomechanics, and I like to apply the sprint drill principles, whether it's the A series, the dribble series, different little hops and circuits of that nature to just get them, making contact with the ground the right way. Because ultimately, anybody can program sprints. Like you can say, okay, I just watched the Miami Dolphins and they had a speed session. They posted a snip on Twitter, or something like that, and it's just they're running tens or they're running 20s or they're running 30s. It's like anybody can program that, but can you coach that? Can you dive into the little things to mitigate injury risk or to contribute to performance? And so, in the off season especially, I like to keep things just very movement centric and just kind of tap into speed every once in a while. Most of what I do is 20 yards and down, mostly resisted sprint work. And then as we get deeper into the off season, we might tap into some longer speed, 30s, 40s, 50s, and then really get on the hill and just really smash hills. But once we get in season, and now we're talking about juggling the volume of imaging, of footwork drills, of ball skills, of things of that nature, that contributes to their overall training load. And so if I were to have the same mindset I had in the off season and not really take into consideration that they're also getting this extra training in that's maybe doubling up what we were already doing, if not tripling or quadrupling, then I could be putting them in danger just because I'm not considering everything else that's in the equation. So I'll dial back the volume once we get in season and just worry about kind of reference points. So, I'm not so concerned with accumulating volume so much as just like, hey, let's get these drills in every day. And then maybe a couple times, let's just hit a couple short sprints, couple jumps, couple of this, couple of that, and just keep them primed to sprint and keep them speed focused so that this kind of monotonous, slow volume that you get with soccer, lacrosse, um, you know, things like that, field hockey, that they're not forgetting what speed feels like and looks like, and that then they can at least continue to tap into it rather than like forget about it as the season wears on.
Mhm. So as far as running their sprints in season, how many sprints max would you go for a teenage female athlete?
I think it really depends on what the sport coach is doing. So if they're doing like a ton of scrimmaging and they're getting that game speed in, I would say like, first off, are they prepared to handle sprints? Because it's obviously a very high intensity stimulus. It's a very, potent stimulus. And so if they're not in a place to cope with a sprint, then I would say that we need to either dial off the distance or dial off the volume. And so I might start with just some 20-yard repeats, and then just go off of like the eye test. Maybe prescribe 4 to 5, and I see at maybe rep 3, one of the girls is starting to break down. Okay, done. Because now we're accumulating, and I just tweeted about it, garbage volume, and now we're practicing bad habits, and those bad habits can then carry over longer than the habits that maybe we're trying to reinforce. So you know maybe I don't cut off the last 2 reps, maybe I give double the rest, and then on the next rep maybe the rep is still bad, then we're just done altogether. But some athletes respond really well to extra rest, and then they might actually get an extra rep or two. But we also don't want to toe the line and get too greedy, because usually like that 4 to 5 rep threshold might be great, and in 3 weeks you might try to shoot for 8 or 9 just all of a sudden, and they were doing great at 4 or 5. Now you've gotten into 6, 7, 8, and now you're starting to see little things pop up. My hamstrings hurting a little bit. My ankles are hurting a little bit, or my hips are hurting a little bit, little things like that. So, the eye test tells a lot, and just continuing to communicate with them and make sure that they feel confident when they're getting into these sprints and these workouts, so that, you're reinforcing their positive attitudes. You're reinforcing these good things about training. And then they go in with confidence, they execute to a T, rather than like shying away or being scared or kind of approaching with like apprehension. And I'm sure that you've seen some of that as well. So that's kind of the way I do it. But there's a million ways to do it that would be considered right. And I don't think there's really a wrong way, unless you're not taking the athlete into consideration.
I like that you mentioned the idea of maybe increasing that rest time. And it reminds me of that tweet I just saw with the field hockey girls that you're working with, and how they said, oh, well, we expected to be run into the ground and moving the whole session. And I see a lot of that. A lot of these young female athletes just expect every session to just be obliterated. And when we're training something like speed, that's not the goal. So, can you explain that and also go into how long that rest time should be between sprints?
Yeah. Um, so, I think that with certain sport coaches, that there's this sort of culture where they get uncomfortable when their athletes are sitting still. So the athletes naturally respond to that, and they feel that they're going to make me uncomfortable if they sit still for too long. So they want to make sure that they either sort of give off this vibe that they're constantly doing something, so that I don't get upset and run them or something. I don't know. But we'll be sitting there for like, all right, we've got 3 minutes. Go
Yeah.
grab some water. Like, we just grabbed water. Like, okay, well, go grab more. And if you don't feel like you need water, then go think about water. You know, do something on this rest break. Smile, talk with your friends, think about the rep, let things simmer, and then come back to this next rep with extra energy. Like, that's what this is. I'm exchanging rest time for quality work. and that's it. So I know a lot of people operate under the premise of like every 10 yards you run, you should be resting 1 minute. So if I run a 10, I'm resting a minute. If I run a 20, 2 minutes, a 30, 3 minutes. But eventually it's okay to tap into some shorter rest periods as long as quality is not dipping. Because while speed is fantastic and important, um, when you're in the game, you're in the heat of battle, you might have to run down the field and make a play, and then you're jogging back, and then boom, turnover. You got to get right back out there and do it again. So I at least want to make sure that they're exposed to that every once in a while to make sure that, hey, it's okay to kind of run further every now and then, and it's okay to not be, completely fresh. But once they're so fatigued that it looks terrible, or the energy is dropping, or the times are dropping substantially, like, okay, I've overstepped. And I think everyone has been guilty of that at some point or another. But you have to learn from those mistakes so that you can give your athletes a great shot at success, and that you're not letting your sort of oversight turn into something bad and detrimental for them.
Mhm. It's so funny you mentioned that coaches feel awkward when athletes are just standing there. And I've seen a lot of this, especially if like the parents are watching the session. Coaches are like, "Oh, well, I need to put on a show here and make it look like everyone's working so hard." But when it compromises our speed development, then just suck it up, give them the rest. And I love that you mentioned that athletes can use that rest to think about their form on the next rep, or to talk with their friends, enjoy the day, look at the surroundings. It's okay to just chill out for a second. So thanks for sharing that. Now let's gloss over mechanical work before we get into conditioning. So in the soccer community, when it comes to working on sprint mechanics, I always hear like, let's work on arms first, like move the arms fast, aggressive arms. And I'm like, yes and no. So can you go into like how important are the arms in sprinting, or should we be focusing on ground contact first? Like what are some of your cues for working on sprint mechanics?
So I'll start with the ground contact part, and then I'll go to the arm part. So I like to look at it as your feet and ankles take the brunt of the stress every time that you put your foot down. And if you're making contact with the ground in a bad way, then it's going to be really hard to get anything out of it. So your arms could be fantastic. Your trunk could be fantastic. Your hips could be great. Let's say that you have extremely explosive jumps. If your ankles are trash, and you don't have a foundation to apply that force into the ground, then speed is going to be very difficult to achieve. So you could have the greatest frequency on the planet, you could have great strength and power, but if those ankles are collapsing and giving, and they're in bad positions to apply force, be it angles, ground contact surface area, um, sneaking up on the ground versus pressing through it. I mean, so all of those things matter a lot, and that force ultimately has to travel. You have to hit the ground, and then you get that force right back through your body, and that's going to be kind of what propels you along. So, um, ground contact is where I start my focus. Dorsiflexing, hitting on kind of the front half of the foot, keeping heels off the ground, because if that heel's hitting, then you're probably going to be slamming on the brakes, because your foot's going to probably be out in front of you. So you're slamming the brakes down, then you're going to flop your foot down, and then you're just kind of pulling yourself down the turf, down the grass, down the pitch, whatever your area of competition might be. And now we're talking hamstrings. So ultimately, that's kind of why I focus on ground contact first, because I want to make sure that when we do start to speed things up, with the arms. So say that somebody has slow frequency, or or fast frequency. If they're very slow, I want them to speed up their arms, because generally your arms and legs will sort of mirror each other. So if I have very fast hands and that's all I can think about, my legs will probably be fast too. On the other hand, if my feet are already crazy fast and I'm seeing the athletes not applying force, I'm going to tell them to exaggerate that arm swing, make it bigger and more violent. And now we're going to see that force to where they're actually finishing that push through the ground. And now we're seeing that projection. So arms are a good, simple cue to get different things from the athletes, but ankles and feet kind of set the foundation for all of that to be successful or unsuccessful, in my opinion and in my experience.
What are some cues that you use to make sure that the positioning of the ankle is good?
So when I'm doing like the series, for example, I like to just say knee up, toe up. So that way they're getting to that good 90 degrees of hip flexion. They're getting to a good toe up position. And then I tell them to just put the foot right back where it came from. So, they raise up, their dorsiflex, and then boom, hitting back down to the ground. But, as we all know, athletes don't all respond greatly to every cue. So one of my other good cues to use is to pretend there's like a bucket hanging off your foot. And if your toe falls, the bucket's just going to roll right off your foot and you're going to lose it. We want to try to keep that bucket balanced on the edge of the foot as you're going down and making contact with the ground. And some people, even though it's kind of a convoluted cue, they visualize that much better. Like, oh, don't spill the bucket, don't spill the bucket. And now suddenly, like everyone's toes are up and it looks a lot better.
Mhm. I'm gonna steal that one. Don't spill the bucket. So that's a great visual for some of the people listening. And I do want to just touch on just the injury risk side of this. So when the foot is not positioned properly and that toe is pointing down, the bucket spilling, how can that increase injury in young athletes?
So it's the other things that go along with that happening. So if I'm striking with the heel and my toes reaching out, I'm going to be overextended out in front of me. And our bodies like to use what's called the path of least resistance. So whatever's the most easy muscle to fire through there to accomplish the task, it's just going to go straight to it. So in this case, if my heels are digging into the ground, if you've ever done a glute bridge, we think like, okay, we're digging those heels into the ground or activating hamstrings. So if the heels are out in front, we're striking out in front, and my hamstrings at full length. Now I'm pulling through that hamstring to get my body to move rather than pressing through my glutes and hamstrings and distributing that stress between the two muscles as well as the others. And now suddenly I'm overusing that hamstring over and over and over. And it's not necessarily one bad step that's going to contribute to it, but it's the cumulative load over time that as we keep digging that heel down in front and we're relying heavily on hamstrings rather than sort of the combination of hamstrings and glutes, quads, the whole hip complex, all those stresses are just eating away at the hamstring over and over and over until eventually we start seeing cramps or tweaks, pulls, tears, um, the whole 9 yards. And I've noticed that in the majority of hamstrings that I've seen in the last 5 years as a coach, and then even when I was an athlete for 5 years at Iowa, watching different athletes in different sprints, it's the athletes who tend to overextend, and it's always right there that I see boom hamstring. And when I've failed to do my job and fix those things, I'll even see them on day one and say, "Man, I've got to fix that. Got to fix it." And here we are, 2 weeks down the road, a month down the road, 3 months down the road, and even though it might be a little better, I still see flashes of it. And then suddenly I hear, "Yeah, I pulled my hamstring today." I'm like, "Oh no."
Mm.
And it sucks because I knew I could have done something about it, but I just couldn't solve the problem. And you know that's why I think that fixing those little things, just striking underneath the body, striking more on the more midfoot or the front 2/3 of the foot rather than the heels. Little things like that go a long ways in just muscle coordination and reducing the risk of injury from my experience.
And this is stuff that they should be working on the majority of the year.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like to put those drills in every single warm up.
Mm.
Not necessarily the striking every single time. Like I'm not always doing turnover drills, but I like to do maybe acceleration drills on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and then Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, or Tuesday, Saturday, or whatever other 2 days. I'm putting in turnover drills or some combination of the two so that we're just working on those habits over and over and over instead of just letting them defer to where they feel the most comfortable, which is poor posture, and just sort of getting through the task rather than executing the task.
Mhm. Well, that was a great discussion on speed and some actionable steps for everyone. Let's shift gears into conditioning. And this is very timely because there's been a lot of conversation recently on Twitter with conditioning. And I think a lot of people just have misconceptions about it and assume when we say conditioning, it's long distance running or jogging, but there's so much that goes into it. So, Brendan, why don't you just define conditioning and what encompasses it?
So I'm very broad with my definition of conditioning. I feel like most people are, they attach conditioning to aerobic only. They're like, conditioning means amazing aerobic system. Conditioning means monotonous long runs and endless tempos and all these, gassers and suicides and whatever else. Uh, what I think of when I think of conditioning is we are conditioning the body for a given task. So if for example, I want to be a good sprinter, when I sprint and I continue to sprint over and over and over, and I'm working on mechanics, I'm teaching my body to cope with and execute the task of sprinting. Okay, that's important for sprinters and basketball players and football and soccer. Everybody can probably benefit from repeated sprints at some point or another. Then we go to agility. When we're conditioning agility, we're learning foot placement. We're learning how to move our body through space. We're learning how to control our center of mass to be efficient and execute the task at hand. So, just doing that task, let's say I do it the way that everyone prescribes sprints. Let's say I go no longer than 5 seconds and I give them 3 to 5 minutes rest between. I'm still conditioning because I'm teaching them the skill and conditioning and refining that skill. That is agility, change of direction. So I look at conditioning as anytime that you repeat a task for the sole sake of mastering the task as it pertains to sport so that it can be broadly applied and benefit the athlete so that they can sort of last the season, they can be resilient. That when they have to call on those skills, they're not pulling out like some Fisher Price screwdriver, they're pulling out like a Phillips, right? Right? They don't have these big, ugly, unrefined toys. They have like legitimate, tools they're pulling out of the belt and they're using them in the game, in the course of a match or a meet because they've refined them over time. You know, the normal conditioning that we hear about is these gassers and what have you. And in the sense of conditioning, you are conditioning those athletes to now become cross country runners. So if we're talking about conditioning as task refinement, you are refining the task of slow, monotonous running, and you're refining the ability to jog under fatigue. So that's why I kind of differentiate between the classical conditioning and conditioning as it pertains to sport specific tasks or even skills that broadly apply and support those sport specific tasks.
So, no to gassers, no to suicides. What do you recommend for soccer players for conditioning, for game speed?
So what I've done quite a bit is I'm actually not against the gassers and suicides if they're prescribed a certain way. So if the speeds are terrible, if the monotony, if the volume is terrible, if all of these things are sort of creating a bad equation where the athlete's destroyed, quality is dropping, whatever, like now it's off limits. But I actually like to use tempos and I like to use variations of shorter suicides as long as they're not like dead at the end. So something I've been using for the field hockey girls these last few weeks is, all right, we're going to the 5 and back. That's it. Like that's 1 rep. And then after that, you get 10 seconds rest. You're going to the 10, 10 and back, just the 10. Like, yeah, but it has to be fast. Okay, you get 15 seconds rest. And then every time I push that back 5 yards, I increase that rest so that they're getting some sort of replenishment, but they're still able to get out there, burst off the line, touch the line, come back. Another thing I've been using a lot of is hill sprints. So there's a hill that I use that's roughly takes about 4 to 6 seconds to get up. And I'm just going to line them up at the bottom of the hill, single file, go, 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 go. And they just walk back, rest, as slow as they want. As soon as they get back to the bottom, they're up again. But again, it's just 4 second bouts, 6 second bouts. So they're not tapping into, they're not getting destroyed from it. And I'm only giving them like 5 or 6 reps. So within 3 to 5 minutes, they're getting a very high quality, very demanding conditioning session, speed endurance session, however you want to define it. But the quality is there the whole time. The effort's there the whole time. The intensity is there the whole time. And as soon as that drops, I'm telling a girl to walk to the back of the line. And if she gets up there, she's still dead. She can walk back to the line again until I feel like she's in a place that she can then go up and give me a good rep. Otherwise, just like we talked about earlier, done.
Mhm. So first of all, I'm really jealous that you have hills. I miss hill sprints. Florida, for whatever reason, doesn't have hills anywhere. But huge fan of hills. And I love that you're trying to keep the quality up, the intensity. And I just hear a lot of in the soccer community, well, like players cover 6 to 9 miles in a game. They're jogging and walking most of the time. What do you say to those people when they're questioning these high intensity drills that you just mentioned?
Say that we have a finite number of buckets to fill to support that soccer player. And if the majority of their practices are spent filling those other buckets, filling that walking and jogging and occasionally running fast or occasionally sprinting, and the majority of their time is in that walking jogging category, that means that you're filling the walking jogging category the majority of practice, the majority of a game. So why would I then spend more time where time's already spent? Why not spend time on skills and refining skills so that they're not pulling hamstrings when they're tired? So that when the game calls for it, that they can hit faster speeds and go, get that breakaway goal. Or if someone gets a steal on them and they have to go on defense, they can get back and recover quickly and go make that play instead of giving up a goal. Like there's so many ways that that speed component can benefit those soccer athletes that by avoiding it, you're basically saying, yeah, we're fast enough. And I would say that most coaches would love for an extremely fast team. So if I'm going to spend time training these athletes, why not train them in a safe way that helps them develop that power and explosion and then that mechanical efficiency to be able to flip on and flip off that speed switch so that they can then make those plays, so that they can then, there's the concept of speed reserve as it pertains to conditioning. If I up those miles per hour, now it's easier to carry a lesser miles an hour. So if my top speed is 20 and the game is usually at 15 or 12, I'm going to be able to last much longer because I don't need to tap into 90% of my speed. Whereas a 15-mile-an-hour athlete running around at 12 all game is going to get gassed very fast because that is so close to their ceiling. So, a little more than an elevator pitch, but that's kind of what I would say to those coaches.
My last question, and this is a controversial one in our community, but there are a lot of coaches listening, and I just want to hear it from you, Brendan. But Should coaches be using the time mile or time 2 mile as a test to see how conditioned teenage female soccer players are?
Oh my goodness. Absolutely not.
I
No
had to
way.
ask.
No way. So if you're gonna suit that soccer player up and you want her to go, run with her cross country team, by all means, go time her 2 mile. But I don't think that this 2 mile test has a high correlation to, you know, measuring the skill of playing soccer, measuring the capacity to play the game of soccer. Because there's sprints in there, there's cutting, there's all these different things, ball handling. You have to make decisions. Like a 2 mile is just shut your brain off and run for however long, 12, 15, 20 minutes, depending on the player. So I don't know how that correlates well to the game of soccer.
Well, sadly, it's still very common, especially with a lot of high school fitness tests. I know. I've been trying to fight this for 10 years now, but hopefully people listen to this podcast. But what should they replace that 2 mile test with so we can give them something better to turn to?
That's a very good question. I really hadn't considered that, to be honest, because I think that soccer and lacrosse and field hockey, sports like that, are just so diverse in their skill sets that if you wanted to measure a soccer player, then look at the soccer combine, look at what they do at the combines, and I don't believe a 2 mile is a part of that combine. So I trained an athlete who was post collegiate, and he wanted to make the MLS, and we did not spend a second conditioning in the traditional sense. We spent every waking moment conditioning in the sense of ankle stiffness, reactivity, speed, power, explosion, change of direction, and those sorts of things. And then when he went to the MLS combine, he did extremely well. He ran a fantastic, I want to say it's a 30-meter sprint. Um, so if you can perform well in those ways, and then you show up on the field and you can make plays, I mean, what better measurement can you get than productivity on the field? It's the same debate in uh, football. Athletes go to combines and they crush them, but does the film? Well, they put a heavy emphasis on the film and less emphasis on the test. So if the way that you play the game is at such a level that you're dominating your opponents, you're raising the level of your teammates and all of these things, like that's a much better measurable than say a 2 mile run.
Mhm.
Um, but if you must run them and you must do those things, then I would say something like 20-yard repeats and just go and see, do like a cumulative time, or you can do 50-meter repeats. And again, maybe you accumulate 800 or 1,000 meters, but you're giving like decent rest between, like 30 to 60 seconds, and just sort of gauging their energy throughout that. I mean, I'm not really sure how you can adequately test one or two things and be like, that's a good soccer player. There's just
Mhm.
no way.
And that's such a good point. It can really just be, okay, well, who shows up to that preseason playing their best when we scrimmage and when we play small sided games and 1v1s and 2v2s and 4v4s. And that reminds me, when I was a senior at Johns Hopkins, our coach got rid of our fitness tests altogether. He was like, I'll know who's going to be our starting 11, and if you're not in the starting 11, there were 35 girls on the team, then you were screwed. Like, so that was motivation enough to get ready for that preseason. And it even just has that cognitive component. You can't really like test that. You only can watch them play and see if they're ready. So I'm really glad you said that.
Yeah, I mean, there's just so many things, and the eye test, I think we talked about this before, is just so powerful. Like when you see a dominant athlete out there and there are other athletes that are quote unquote inferior or not quite to that level, um, it's very easy to see that discrepancy. They kind of jump off the field at you, and you can just say, ah, that one for sure, starter, versus, the one who's sort of, kicking dirt or not engaged the whole time. Like that body language stands out, that energy stands out. So it's actually probably pretty easy, just eye test wise, when they're playing, who is it? Now, obviously, at the collegiate level, everyone is very skilled, everyone is very fit, everyone is ready to play collegiate soccer. But now you're looking for those intangible things, and it's just so hard to measure, in my opinion.
Mhm. Another thing that just came to mind was it's also just such a waste of like 3 to 4 days of preseason doing fitness testing. I mean, scrimmages and early season games start a few weeks later usually, and it's like, why are we wasting our time here when we could be working on team stuff? I just thought of this. I was like, that doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, we see the phrase opportunity cost. What are we doing here that can maybe be replaced with something better? And you just spelled it out. You could replace those dang fitness tests with something that actually translates to the game or looks like the game or is a foundation that you can build the game on, rather than just like, there's like 50, 60, 70-year-old people that just walk out of their door every day and they jog a 2 mile. Like if they could stay in your fitness test, then it's probably not a great test.
I hope everyone really takes this to heart and this has been such an insightful conversation. And Brendan, I definitely want people to follow up with you and see all the great content you're posting on Twitter, as well as do you do remote programs?
Yeah, I do.
Awesome. And you do all ages, all sports?
Yeah, for the most part, as long as there's, as long as they're in a place that they can take coaching and that they're invested in it and they understand sort of the different demonstrations and what have you. I definitely have a wide variety of remote clients.
Awesome. And where can everyone find you on social media and website?
So it's at Brendan Thompson, but there's no second O in Thompson because someone else already took it. And then my website is btacceleration.com. And it's EXCELERATION rather than the normal word acceleration.
Wonderful. So be sure to check that out in the caption below, everyone, and follow up with Brendan and his amazing work. Brendan, thank you so much for the conversation today, and I'll see you guys on the next episode.